Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of the Afghanistan podcast. Joining us today, we have Professor David Lesch from Trinity University, Texas. David is a professor of history and Middle East and specializes in Syria. Actually, calling David a specialist in Syria is a somewhat of an understatement. David has visited the country over 30 times in his career, wrote many books on it, and was also the official biographer of former President Bashar al-Assad. Throughout that episode, David had the chance to personally meet President Bashar al-Assad many times and was able to create a personal bond and a relationship with him. We had a conversation with David about that, and you can find that discussion in episode 47 of this episode and of this podcast, and I'll leave a link to that. Outside of academia, David has many other interests and hobbies. David has been advisor of U.S. policymakers for the Middle East. He was also involved in track to diplomacy to end the Syrian conflict. But also outside of all of this, David was also a professional baseball player, a career he had to end short because of a personal injury. And David has his own biography coming out, I think end of August, early September, and I personally can't wait to get my hands on it. And when it does come out, we'll try and get David back onto the show. So if you have not subscribed to the channel already, please do so. Your support is very much appreciated. With that said, welcome David to the show, and thank you for your time.
Well, it's great to be here, Tathin, again, and to take part in what I'm sure will be a stimulating conversation as always. And thank you for the plug for the biography, which is written by Catherine Nixon Cook, and she did a wonderful job of that. And you're correct; it'll be out late August, early September.
Brilliant, David. How can people get hold of a copy when it does come out?
On Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble, wherever people usually purchase books. It's published by Trinity University Press, so you can go to their website and there may be a discount as well. And you can actually pre-order it now, although I sound like a salesman, but.
No, please do share a link with me and I'll leave it in the notes. And also when it comes out, share a link with me as well, and I'll kind of put a post on.
Okay, thank you. I will. Great.
So David, thank you very much. Last time you came, I really enjoyed our conversation, which is why I reached out to you again if you would join us. Last time, I believe when we spoke last time, it was just around about when President Bashar al-Assad's regime collapsed and HTS came into power. So to begin with, how do you see events since then, since HTS has been in power in Syria? How do you see their performance?
Well, probably, since I'm a professor, I'm used to giving grades. I probably give them a sturdy C grade. There have been some positive things. There have obviously been some negative things with sectarian violence, but the challenge that they face and still face is enormous. I mean, Syria is a deeply fractured state. It's highly militarized. During the Civil War, the over decade-long Civil War, there was the retreat of the state. The state really, and state government, national government didn't really exist over much of the country. And so when that happens, when you have the breakdown of the state, people retreat into their sectarian fortresses, be it religious or ethnic. And that's what happened in Syria. And so now you have a group, HTS, which has very little experience in terms of national governance. They governed to a degree in the province of Idlib in the northwest, but in terms of national governance, they don't really have much experience, and yet they're trying to recreate the state in what was, pretty much a vacuum. And amid a lot of sectarian identity violence that had been going on for, the course of the Civil War, and in a situation where, various ethnic and religious groups, were indoctrinated to think other ones were heathen scum. And they knew nothing but warfare and to, in essence, carry out violence against this heathen scum or to dismiss them. And this goes, back and forth through many of the the different sects and religious and ethnic sects in Syria. And so you have one of these groups, who came to power and trying to put all of this back together, piece Syria back together again, amid, economic collapse, amid international interference, amid their lack of, as I said earlier, their lack of experience in any sort of, mid-level cadres that could form, that have the skill set to run a national bureaucracy. Because it's not like when the Baath Party came to power in 1963 in Syria, they had a party ideology, they had a system, they had governance ideology, they had again a cadre of followers. HTS, other than an extreme religious ideology, really does not have that, and so there is a institutional vacuum that they inherited and that they really haven't been able to rectify. There's an ideological vacuum as well. So lots of things, to try to piece together and put together. And it's, I don't want to say it's an impossible task, but it's incredibly challenging. And, quite frankly, despite the violence we saw in the Alawite areas in the Northwest in March and the recent violence in the Druze areas, and then some points of violence throughout, quite frankly, I'm surprised there hasn't been more. But this might, be a sign of things to come. Hopefully not. But we'll see. So again, they've done some good things, but they've just been unable, and maybe it's beyond anyone's capability after such a devastating and brutalized, a devastating civil war that brutalized the country, to piece it back together again.
Thank you, David. I agree with you. I mean, putting aside whether the way they took power, the rights and wrongs of it, given we are where we are, personally, I'm surprised as well that there hasn't been more violence than what we've seen so far. And also, I am kind of holding my breath a little bit as well, expecting more to come. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see. But also, what is it like with the former Baath Party? Were they able to maintain any of that kind of structure, or those personnel who ran the country before, the administrators of the country?
Yeah, I mean, they came to power and they were dominated by minority sects, Alawites and Druze in the leadership positions. Just the way Syria emerged out of the mandate, the Alawites and Druze had been recruited into the army during the French mandate years, and they were willingly wanted to join the army, willingly do so, because it was their only way of social upward mobility, whereas the dominant Sunni class looked down on any sort of tacit cooperation with the French authorities. And so they had a predominant, just by chance, position, especially in the officer corps, in the military. When the Baath Party, kind of merged with the Syrian military after the mandate and upon independence in 1946 and in the early 50s, they had not only the ideology, but they had a power base. Yeah. And they were able to take power and stay in power. But as most things, as you well know, the purity of the ideology dissipated over the course of time, and it became kind of this vehicle for acquiring and power and staying in power that quickly became dynastic under the Assads, and where the Baath Party ideology, other than a few items, particularly anti-Israeli ideology and Arab nationalism, other than that, it kind of faded away in terms of their socialist base and so forth. And so, but they had it at the beginning, and more importantly, they had again that power and advantageous position in the military. And the whole anti-Israeli ideology, they obviously it was real, but they obviously trumped that up and in order to unite the country against common enemies. And so they were able to keep that together. And then once the Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, created these overlapping 17 intelligence agencies and to keep everything together and sell the idea that, the Faustian bargain that you will provide stability. You may lose some freedoms and may not have certain freedoms, but will provide stability. And what gave credence to that argument was the fact that, their neighbors in Lebanon and eventually in Iraq, countries that also have, have sectarian difficulties over the years, they're falling apart. And so that Faustian bargain was accepted by most, Syrians until it wasn't, when the Arab Spring broke out.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. I'm just thinking of how Saddam Hussein was removed from Iraq and the country fell into chaos. And there was a realization at the time that maybe there was a mistake to dissolve the whole Baath Party alongside the Saddam loyalists. And maybe if they had been kept in place, there would have been a better structure around which a new government could have been formed. Has there been any of that learning applied in Syria, or are we doing exactly the same thing? Is the Baath Party now completely gone?
Yeah, much of it is gone. And certainly many of the military, as you know, was two mistakes in that regard in Iraq. They not only disbanded the Baath Party, they disbanded, the military, especially the officer corps. And as you know, many people in Iraq and in Syria joined the Baath Party, not so much because of an adherence to the ideology, but because it was a way of upward social mobility that gave them a little better pay, better access, and these are skilled bureaucrats, they're professors in schools and others that make society run in essence. And so that was a big mistake. In Syria, they haven't done it quite as much. They've kept some holdovers from the previous regime, from the Assad era, but not many. Many fled. One of the problems in Syria today has been vigilante justice against those who are deemed supporters of Assad. And so many of the people, that kept that regime afloat are no longer there or in hiding. And then, of course, they did disband and got rid of, or people fled from the Syrian military because they replaced it with their own HTS-based military. So that's an additional problem is, they didn't bring anything really into it that could replace all that. Not that what was there was great to begin with, but at least there was, a smattering of competent bureaucrats who kept, a corrupt and system going. Now it's these are these hollowed out institutions with, inexperienced officials that were appointed or brought in by HTS trying to run things in very difficult circumstances. It's difficult to run these things when everything is going well, when the economy is going well, when they don't have any outside interference. But all of that thrown in, it's a very difficult ask for these officials to run anything other than in a episodic, spasmodic way, reacting more than coming up with policies that will move the country forward.
There was recently a huge unrest in the town of Sweida, and there was a conflict between the Druze and the Bedouin around that town. And also there was some involvement from the government as well. Can you explain to us a little bit how that all started and what was the government's role in it?
Well, it's complicated and there's still information coming out, but, apparently, and this often happens, there was an incident that sparked already simmering sectarian strife. This is how the whole uprising began in Syria, if you recall. There was an incident in Daraa, the province over from Sueda, that mushroomed into an uprising and then a civil war. So these sparks, when there is existing tension, when especially, animosities, inter-sectarian animosities, and the Druze and the Sunni Bedouin, have always had kind of a tense relationship in Sueda based on demographics, population transfers, these things over the many years. And the Druze, of course, are convulsively protective of their semi-autonomy. Yeah. On the one hand, they really consider themselves one of the founders of the modern Syrian state because of the Druze-led uprising against the French in the early years of the French Mandate, and in their position in the Baath Party in the early years of the Baath Party. And they've, the Assads, both father and son, kind of kept hands off toward the Druze. And during the civil war, the Druze remained fairly neutral. And I think, and therefore are seen by many of the opposition, like HTS, like some of these Sunni Bedouin, as having cooperated with Bashar al-Assad by not opposing him, so to speak. And so I think these simmering tensions, and just the fact that, there's a core, once this incident happened and you had Sunni Bedouin versus Druze violence, and then the government sent down its military and security apparatus to try to quell. Well, the HTS military led the Syrian army, which is really HTS and its allies. There's a conundrum there in that they need that power. That's what brought Ahmed Shara and the other leaders of HTS to power. Yet their core is jihadist. Yeah. It is very extremist in terms of their ideology and their allies, who they can't control, maybe don't want to control, or else it'll produce, another type of problem for the current government. And so you send them in, much as they were sent in the Alawite areas in the Northwest last March, and it just exacerbates the situation because they go, I don't know if you're familiar with the term hog wild, but they go, it's like a shooting spree. I mean, all of these pent-up feelings of revenge and animosity just come out. And so bringing in the military didn't really quell the situation. It exacerbated the situation. And the Druze have their own militias. And I mean, that's one of the things. Almost every group in every area in the country has their own militia for protective purposes, to protect drug trade mafias, whatever. And there's guns all over the place. After 10 years of civil war. So it's a very militarized, weaponized society. And these incidents, fan the flames of already existing sectarian tension, from that emerged. I mean, that was there even before the Civil War, but that was embellished and increased due to the Civil War. And so I think that's kind of, the sort of the 10,000 foot view of why this happened in the Druze. And plus, again, remember that, many of those in the Syrian government, HTS-led government, Sunni jihadists, extremists, Sunni, very conservative, some would say extremist Sunni ideology. They don't consider the Druze to be Muslim at all. They don't consider the Alawites to be Muslim. These are schisms of schism of a schism. It's a syncretic religion, and both the Alawites and the Druze. And, so you add that, that's just a little bit more fuel in the fire. Yeah. When a spark, turns into, it turns into something much more than a local disturbance. And now you have a regional problem.
So true. And to complicate things more, the Druze seem to have quite a bit of support and sympathy from Israel as well.
Yes.
And I've actually heard people from inside Syria who were initially sympathetic to the Druze because of the victimization that they were getting. But now, because of the support coming in from Israel, they're kind of losing with some other groups some of that sympathy because of the hatred of Israel. So everything is sitting on top of everything else and making things more and more complicated and more split loyalties and interests on all sides.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. There's many layers to this, and the Israeli position has only inflamed and exacerbated situations. I mean, Israel's in there for their own strategic reasons. They're hoping, to make the Druze, allies in order to have a buffer, in the south. And of course, there are Druze in northern Israel, and there's some pressure from Druze in northern Israel who have family members in southern Syria, putting pressure on the government to protect them. And of course, the Israelis have been, as you know, have been not shy in saying outright that we will protect the Druze, and they're bombing, current Syrian government facilities just to let them know, not to send the Syrian army down there. So yeah, that doesn't help the Druze cause with many other Syrians. But at this point, and most of the Druze in the beginning, they said, thank you, Israel, but we don't want your support. There's some that do. I mean, that's one thing. The Druze aren't this monolithic block. There are different elements within the Druze that have different agendas, but largely most of them said, no, we don't want your help. But now, in light of this, they may welcome Israel's protection, which again will just inflame attitudes between the Druze and other elements in Syria.
Yeah. Talking of the role of Israel, what's the relationship with Ahmad al-Shara and Israel? Because on one hand, he's constantly reminding everyone that our enemy is not Israel, it's Iran. But at the same time, Israel's kind of just willy-nilly going around bombing military bases whenever and wherever they feel necessary, which kind of undermines the central government's own authority and legitimacy. So how is he balancing that whole relationship with Israel himself?
With great difficulty, I think. I think a sign of that difficulty was the fact in a speech that he gave right after Syria bombed the Ministry of Defense in Damascus due to the violence in the Druze area. In speeches and before that time, he'd always said the state of Israel. In this speech, he said the Israeli entity, which is the classic anti-Israel, nomenclature over the many decades, and what the Iranians, have typically said, not recognizing that Israel is a state. And so, that shift, it may just be semantic, but I think it gives some insight into the conundrum he faces because, he has to get the sanctions lifted. He's gotten many of them lifted, improve the relationship with the United States. There's even a billboard I know I've seen of Trump and Ahmad Shara shaking hands or something, or standing next to each other in downtown Damascus. And to do that, he's had to play nice with Israel to this point. And I think what the Trump administration has started to realize is, not only in Gaza, but also in Iran, but also now in Syria, that Israel's just going to do what it wants to do. And Israel's going to pursue its own strategic interests ultimately, while trying to stay in favor with the Trump administration. But, they're going to do what they deem is necessary. And so that has run up against, the charm offensive that Trump has engaged in with Damascus. And so, how Ahmed Shara deals with this, and there have been, of course, credible reports of Israelis and Syrians meeting and trying to map out some sort of deconfliction and all that before the recent events. Trump wants Syria to join the Abraham Accords, and Bashar and others have said, well, we'll consider it type of attitude, not saying no. So, there seem to be two different vectors running up against each other, an Israeli one based on security and the post October 7, 2023 attitude and mentality that has colored everything that Israel has done since that time, including in Syria, and Trump's charm offensive and his transactional need to make a deal, which he always wants to do because he wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And so, in the middle of all this is Ahmed Sadah.
Yeah.
Increasingly, his base, as you pointed out earlier, with Israel's carte blanche that they have in bombing anything in Syria, his base is starting to get a little bit upset that he's not been taking any action, or at least rhetorically. And so I think, him calling Israel an entity rather than a state is a sign of that. And so we'll have to keep an eye on that. Will he keep going in that direction? And that could create a whole nother point of friction with Israel and with the United States.
Yeah, I think it's so true. I can see on a number of occasions, U.S. President Trump is kind of losing patience with Israel as well. But then there's a lot of forces, kind of like deep state within the USA that's pushing Trump towards Israel. Whereas, so for example, when Trump came to the Middle East, he didn't even go and visit Israel. Also, when there was that whole peace treaty with Yemen, it was just between USA and Yemen, and there was no clause in it that Yemen is not going to continue attacking Israel. But it also seems like increasingly, I think it seems to me that Trump seems a bit fed up of the whole situation and wants USA to be able to exit Syria. Do you think there's signs of that, that USA is trying to exit Syria, which is why it's allowing the Turks kind of greater access into northern Syria as well?
No, I think that's correct. In fact, during Trump's first term, he tried to exit Syria. And it was only the Pentagon that pushed back, saying, look, we need at least some troops to try to keep ISIS from reforming, keep it down, etc. So that's always been his tendency. And it's his tendency, obviously, not to interfere in other countries' affairs and just to facilitate deals that will bring about some level of stability and overall peace in the region based on the Abraham Accords. And that's how he sees Syria right now. But I think you're right. I think Turkey coming in and establishing this defense relationship with the Syrian government was inevitable. And I think the U.S. in the Trump administration has definitely given it the green light. I mean, he listens quite a bit to Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and to President Erdogan in Turkey. I think he respects their knowledge and seems to follow through with what, they recommend. And, the whole opening up to Syria was, basically Mohammed bin Salman's idea and his pushing it with President Trump. So I think, he would like to just, as you said, get U.S. forces out of Syria. Again, I think the Pentagon will push back, particularly if there's if ISIS continues to reform. They have a little bit. They've been carrying out some violence, and that's another. Speaking of conundrum, which seems to be the word of the day, the conundrum for the Syrian government. They're cut from the same cloth, and yet they're against each other now. And ISIS has been carrying out some attacks in Damascus and in some other cities, and trying to carry out mass casualty events. So, the government has to, has to deal with that. And so, they'll probably want a U.S. presence to try to help keep the ISIS down. And if they keep a good relationship with Trump, maybe that will continue to occur. And then you have the whole Syrian government, HTS-led Syrian government and Kurdish issue. Speaking of sectarian issues and trying to reintegrate the country and to integrate the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely made up of Kurds, back into the Syrian army. That's all tied into security in the northeast and east, which is where ISIS cells are still located.
Yeah. Where is this ISIS coming from? So are there factions within HTS that are also supportive of ISIS? Because as you said, they kind of come from the same cloth. They both, at least previously, had the same or similar ideologies. So is there support from within the Syrian government for the ISIS attacks, even if not official from the top?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would think certainly amongst officials, no, because it undermines the stability they're trying to recreate, they're trying to create, that would give them legitimacy to continue in power. So I don't think anyone within the Syrian government, who has official positions, what they think when they go home, who knows? But amongst some of the hardcore followers of HTS, and a lot of these guys, including Abu Shadad, years ago were in ISIS or emerged from ISIS or from Iraq or elsewhere. And of course, he, then led the group Jabhat al-Nusra, which was al-Qaeda affiliated. And, al-Qaeda and ISIS generally do not get along. I think Ahmed Shada and, or as he was known at the time, Mohammed al-Jalani, always portrayed Jabhat al-Nusra and then HTS as Syrian bred and, by Syria for Syria, tended to understate how many foreign jihadists were a part of this movement, whereas ISIS was more outsiders and international based and not really interested in Syria. But there is crossover and there's that one group, and I forget the name, Ansar something, but they carried out the attack against the Christian church in Damascus, I think it was last month or a month and a half ago. That's killed a number of people. That was carried out by a group that was allied with HTS in Idlib before Assad fell. And, they're, again, cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
And it's those groups, I think, that can really cause some problems because they're not happy with HTS because of some of the things we were talking about, because they're seen to be too pro-American, pro-Israeli, calling for sectarian harmony and all that, when a lot of these guys just want to get rid of, Druze and Alawites and Christians and so forth. And these guys, that were allied with HTS, now disillusioned perhaps with HTS, or at least with the leadership, may ally with ISIS, or at least carry out the same sort of actions that play into ISIS's hands. So this is a whole big dynamic, that HTS is trying to, as we said earlier, recreate the state in Syria and also recreate itself without splintering into factions that want to disassociate with it now. So it's a very, very complicated, very, very complicated situation. And whenever you have, the breakdown of the state, or you have groups that want to take advantage of that and are able to take advantage of that. And so I think, to our last point regarding U.S. troops there, I mean, I would hope they would stay and support the SDF in trying to keep ISIS as down as possible.
It's very true. Quite often when I look at Syria, it just reminds me so much of what happened in Afghanistan. And very much similar things happened when the Soviets collapsed and all the factions started fighting with each other. But then at the same time, US left. And then that just made the situation so much worse and led to like the next 2 decades of infighting, and no one there to mediate between all of these different factions.
Yeah, I think, and to that point, Tafim, I just don't get old. You forget these points. But speaking of Afghanistan and what we were saying earlier, that we were surprised that there wasn't even more sectarian violence in Syria. I think everyone gave Ahmed Shadah and the HTS-like government a learning curve, and everyone was just so happy, to get out of this civil war with hope, and they were war weary from all that civil war, that that bought them some time. But when is that going to run out? If the lights are still off, the electricity isn't running, if services aren't operating, if government isn't functioning, if even with the sanctions relief, there's even with sanctions relief, there has to be some sort of institutional basis in order to take advantage of and to the investment that may come in with the lifting of sanctions. Where is the business class? Where is the the functioning factories and manufacturing plants and all of these things? So it's going to take a very, very long time. And maybe we're seeing signs of some distress and disenchantment with the current government, as I think I heard somebody say, who has spent a lot of time in Syria recently. He said that as we know, Ahmed Shadah has gone on this charm offensive internationally, that he probably has more legitimacy externally than he does internally.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's something he has to deal with.
I think that's so true. And also, I think, personally speaking, I think it was a little bit of a mistake how from day one, Ahmed Shah has been declaring constantly Iran as their main enemy. I think they need to, just like they have learned to, for now at least, tolerate Israel. I think what they need is more friends right now than more enemies. And Iran could possibly play a constructive role in this whole thing, because I was surprised to see that Iran still has quite significant influence in south of Syria. But also recently, I think the Iranian government made some comment as well that they're willing to support the central government in Syria if they need help. And I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, again, it's a difficult situation because Ahmed Shadah and the new Syrian government, they had to have the lifting of sanctions, and only the U.S. could really do that, because no one wants to run afoul of the U.S. Treasury Department, and in order to do that, Ahmed Shadah had to distance himself from Iran, and particularly because with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who definitely wants Iran out of Syria, pushing the way with Trump in order to mend relations and establish new relations between the U.S. and this new Syrian government. He had to take an anti-Iranian position, which made an enemy of Iran, and they still have influence in the country. And again, a number of weapons have been found, that coming in from Iran or Iranian sources through Iraq to anti-government groups in Syria. So Iran can play a spoiler role. I guess probably not right now because they have their own hands full.
Yeah.
Since the 12-day war with Israel and the U.S. So they're really not able to disrupt things as much as perhaps they would have in the past. But I agree that that Ahmed Shadah, he has to at least establish some sort of friendly relationship with as many countries as possible, because he can't alienate any countries that might play a spoiler role.
Yeah, and especially even because that will then give some comfort to the Shias within Syria as well, if he hasn't got such an aggressive policy towards Iran. But then on the other hand, obviously, as you say, it might upset USA, but it might also upset his own militant kind of Islamists who hate the Shias. So,
yeah, exactly.
I mean, what question I had was that, like, from start, one of the things that I didn't like about this government was its sectarian nature. Personally speaking, I'm from a Sunni background, but just the way they're targeting Shias and making things, turning into like a whole sectarian thing. Just didn't sit right with me. But now I'm beginning to wonder whether is it Ahmad al-Shara who's causing all of this sectarian violence within the country, or is this now like the nature of the region as a whole? Is sectarian hatred, if not violence, the norm in the Middle East now, even more than before, or is what's going on in Syria, is that like an anomaly?
Well, I hope it's an anomaly. That's a great question, and certainly regional rivalries between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shiite Iran hasn't, helped the situation. It tend to, on the surface, exacerbate Sunni Shiite relations. I think it's more nuanced than that, as you know. I think in Syria, it's I wouldn't say it's an anomaly because there have been a number of other states that you've had the breakdown of the state, retreats into sectarian fortresses, in Libya and in Yemen and Iraq, of course, Lebanon in the past, certainly to agree, hopefully not in the future, where these types of things break out and these sectarian violence based on identity politics. And I think it's more that than something systemic with the region, unless you see, the breakdown of the state and the lack of sustainable governance in the region as a cause for all of these things. Maybe that's the systemic problem that allows these festering issues to rise to the fore. And in Syria, we see that. As far as Ahmed Shara, personally, I mean, I haven't met him. I am worked very closely with an NGO in Europe that did get to know him very, very well. And they insist that he's pragmatic, that when he says he wants, inclusive governance and all of this sort of thing, that he means it. But the problem, as we've discussed several times already, is, as you just said, he has to satisfy his base.
Yeah.
And satisfying that base, which is, pretty extreme. And as I said earlier, just wants to get rid of all Druze, Alawites, Christians in the country. Or keep them down and not be a part of the government. He has to deal with all that, and it may be a challenge that he ultimately will not be able to overcome, satisfying his base. It reminds me that of Ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, and the Ikhwan that brought him to power. And these guys were pretty fanatical, as most would say, very extremist Sunni Muslims.
Yeah.
And, Ibn Saud, they formed a state, and ultimately he had to move against them.
Yeah.
He had to put down the extremists. And so is that day coming for Ahmad Shara? And will he have the wherewithal and the fortitude and the ability to do that in Syria with his own base? Should that come, should that base continue to engage in this sectarian violence and continue to prevent him from really rebuilding Syria in the way it should be done?
Yeah. I saw some figures that since HTS came into power, because before they came into power, or when we had the collapse of the Assad government, there was a lot of talk about the torture camps and violence and unjudicial killings and all of that. I was reading somewhere that there's been confirmed reports of at least 800 people tortured to death under HTS since they came into power. More than 300,000 people have had to fled their homes because of the violence. Is this like a systematic thing, or is this mobs going out of control?
I don't know. Quite frankly, I hope it's not systematic, because that would certainly belie what Ahmad Shara has been saying. I think people fleeing certain areas, almost depopulating, is the natural result of fear of sectarian violence, particularly in the Northwest and the Alawite areas. I mean, a lot of Alawites left, or they went to the Russian air base, or left some towns to go to other towns that were more safe, from the the HTS and their allied violence that went on there. Now it has stabilized somewhat, but how? And now with the Druze situation, the Druze have the Israelis. The Alawites didn't have anybody. In fact, the Alawites were trying to paint themselves as Israeli allies all of a sudden. Maybe they'll protect the Alawites as they have been the Druze. But I hope it's not systematic. I think some of this is to be expected. I mean, other than unexploded ordnance, causing deaths, the most deaths, other than these spasmodic points of violence in the Druze and Alawites, has been vigilante violence. Again, Sunnis opposition who have carried out violence against those Alawites, Druze, and other Sunnis, anyone who was seen to be a supporter of Assad. And there hasn't really been any accountability for that, and any sort of transparent judicial reckoning along these lines. And so until that happens, it's almost as if, it's almost as if the government is just casting a blind eye and saying, hey, we don't disagree with what you're doing. We'll try to come in and quell any sort of mass vigilante justice. But on the other hand, they do have their hands full. There isn't much bandwidth or ability or wherewithal for this government to deal with these situations. And, other than sending their troops and their allies in pickup trucks wielding machine guns, in the back, trying to keep a little bit of violence from spiraling out of control. So I don't think it's systematic or certainly government policy, but government neglect and maybe government ineptitude, and their focus right now on staying in power and just getting the basics going and then dealing with these situations as they arise.
Yeah. David, when HTS came into power, they had a lot of support from foreign fighters, whether that was from Central Asia, Chinese, Uyghur Muslims, also Albanians and other places, Balkans, I've heard.
Chechnya, yeah.
Is there some figures on those foreign fighters? How many foreign fighters are there still in Syria, and are the numbers increasing or decreasing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have numbers along those lines. I know the U.S. was one of the conditions for reestablishing relations with the Syrian government and lifting the sanctions was making sure none of these guys had official positions within the Syrian government. And then there were, ways to fudge that. The Syrian government made them Syrian citizens or something like that. And now they could be part of the government. That is a problem. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the number of foreign fighters that were a part of HTS has been understated over the years. And, these guys have, developed their own networks in Syria, and they're difficult to export, to get rid of. And certainly the countries from which they came don't want them back. This was one of the problems with Afghanistan, and Iran now. So, it's a difficult situation, but that is, I think, an issue, but I don't have any numbers, like a percentage of HTS that were foreign fighters.
Sure. There was a lot of criticism I've heard of people saying, why has Bashar al-Assad not made any statements of what's going on in Syria? But personally speaking, I don't think he's in the position to make any statements. When you're sitting in a country like Russia, I don't think the Russian government would allow him that opportunity to make a statement for against what's going on. Last time we spoke, we lightheartedly were talking about a possibility of you going over to Russia to interview Bashar al-Assad. Have you thought about that?
I have not, but I have actually been contacted by some American journalists, let's say, who have shows, who asked me if I could facilitate an interview, and basically I put them in touch with somebody. I don't think any of it has materialized. It'd have to be, journalists who probably have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. You could probably guess who. But it hasn't happened yet. You're right. I mean, yeah, there's Bashar wouldn't be allowed to stay in Russia if he starts, saying things that could complicate Russia's situation right now. His son, I think, if I recall, his son, Hafiz Jr., I guess, came out with an alternative narrative for how he fled the country that made Bashar look better than what was popularly perceived, that he cut and ran type of thing, even on his closest supporters.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
What was that narrative?
Well, that he basically did not abandon things, that he wanted to fight, he wanted to stay, but he was encouraged by the Russians, to leave and so forth, and I mean, it's always something I thought, particularly last March with the Alawite uprising to a certain degree, and then the government response and the violence there, is that, Alawite supporters of Bashar al-Assad, I picture them, one, hiding or out of the country, but that they're just waiting, and if things do unravel in Syria under the current government, which I hope is not the case at all, I hope they stabilize, and just for the people of Syria. But if things start to unravel, I can see many of Assad supporters, and Assad himself, quietly saying, "I told you so." Because they always had this view, the Assads, their loyalists, they always had this view that the country would fall apart without them, that the Syrian people, were incapable of governing themselves. They need us. And it's a very paternalistic and patronizing attitude. I never found it very appealing. And even a number of Assad loyalists in the beginning who fled and then opposed Assad, during the civil war, I talked to them in Beirut and Cairo and Istanbul and other places, and they still had, that they were the only ones, if Assad falls, that could come back and lead things, not the rest of the Syrian population. And so I think, they're kind of just waiting in the wings, so to speak, for things to break down and then maybe assert themselves again, in some way, maybe to try to reframe the narrative again, at least, to their type of rule. You already see it a little bit. And in fact, on Facebook, I saw some Syrians who were, pretty neutral about Assad. They weren't really against him, and they were, one, I think, put out a poll, that was kind of like, what do you think now? What would you take now? Would you go back? And they did this, as with Saddam. Yes. Would you go back to Saddam? At least the lights were on, and there was food in the grocery stores and stuff like that. And now, you're beginning to see a little bit of that with Syria. Would you go back to Bashar al-Assad back in the day? Yeah, things weren't great. It's a repressive, regime and security state. But, there was some level of stability.
Yeah. If we look at what's going on in Syria, a lot of it also is an impact of what's going on in the region. How do you see the role of Turkey within Syria? Do you think they're playing a constructive role, or do you think that they are part of the cause for these problems and part of the reason why Syria is splintering into 2 or 3 regions?
Yeah, I think they're more helpful than not, or trying to be. Certainly in terms of Syrian reconstruction and trade back and forth across the border, which, essentially stopped other than through black markets and stuff like that. but I think, they can play a constructive role. And I think right now, though, the problem is that what are we dealing with? I mean, we want to play a constructive role, but there's really no secure entity and institutional basis where we can really help. I guess one of the things they could do, and to a degree it's started to happen a little bit, is to reshape the Syrian military and make it more inclusive and a professional group, and including the security apparatus, however, not to recreate the security state, the Mukhabarat state that existed under the Assads. So in that sense, I think, especially there, that could play a constructive role that could add to stability and legitimacy of the government. Similarly with the Lebanese army in Lebanon, they're trying right now to make it more legitimate, make it more enhance its abilities to take over for what they hope, this vacuum of Hezbollah in the south, to give the government more legitimacy and to have one national army that truly is representative and can extend its control. And I think in Syria, that's where Turkey could play, in an immediate sense, it's a role, and then down the road, maybe in terms of reconstruction and trade and so forth, along with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states.
Do you know if the Syrian migrants inside Turkey, have they started going back to Syria, or?
Some have. There hasn't been a mass return. I know that, the Turks, it became something of an issue the last few years, and even a political issue, wanting them to return. There have been a number that have returned, but returned to what? Many of their homes have been destroyed. There's, issues of title to property that in the last years of the Assad regime, the Assad government, they were taking away titles and property and reassigning them to their allies in places like Homs and Haman, other places. And so these people come back and their homes will be destroyed, or there's other people living in there. And these are legal problems and issues that, again, the government has to deal with. And so, many of these people don't really, I know from Lebanon too, a number of refugees have returned, certainly not all, because the more violence they see and instability, certainly anyone who's non-Sunni might think twice about returning.
Yes. I think I have a feeling, because Turkey and Pakistan have very close relationships, especially on a military level as well. Yeah. And I think there are some news that at some stage, Turkey might encourage Pakistan support to bring stability into Syria. Mm-hmm. But I do think that Pakistan needs to be very careful about this, because it's, from what we've learned in Afghanistan, Pakistan tried its best to bring stability into its neighboring country, Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, all you get is blame from every side, because there's so much infighting going on that at times you have to make decisions that will upset your own allies. On top of that, you're getting pressure from America and every which side. So I think if Turkey's not very careful, by the end of it, Turkey might end up experiencing exactly what Pakistan experienced. And now we're trying to build relations from ground up with the Taliban that we supported for the last 20 years. And the Taliban have some actual grievances against Pakistan, that Pakistan kind of let them down when USA did invade Afghanistan. So I think it's a very tricky situation, and it might backfire on Turkey if they're not careful.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. If it's not successful, it's a failure, and your regional standing is hurt. And now you have the more instability on your border and more refugees, that will leave the country. So it is a tricky situation, but I think Turkey feels it has no choice, but to try.
David, lastly, how do you see the impact of that 12-day war between Iran and Israel impacting what's going on in Syria? Because I have a feeling that since that war, at least, or if not before, Trump has an actual desire to build better relations with Russia and also with Iran. And obviously, there's lots of challenges in that. But first of all, do you agree with that? But secondly, if America and Iran are able to overcome some of the difficulties that they have with each other, I think that will really help Syria as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with your premise and your statement about Trump. Yeah, he definitely wanted good relations with Russia and Iran. As we said earlier, he wants to make a deal.
Yeah.
You know, he is a transactional foreign policy, and he wants a peace deal. And he was hoping to get a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. It hasn't happened. You know, Putin has other ideas. Ukraine has other ideas. And with Iran, of course, they were in negotiations for resuming the nuclear deal. And again, Israel had other ideas, and some suggest, and I think with a good bit of credibility, that Israel, attacked when they did, perhaps to scuttle, any sort of developing U.S. Iranian deal, and then Trump had to go along with it, so to speak. Especially when he saw how successful the initial Israeli, attacks were. And that, so he wanted to be a part of that. And so it's very difficult to read Trump in the sense he's very, very unpredictable. People internationally, they're always asking me, so, what's Trump going to do? And it's like, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. And unfortunately, a lot of people in government feel the same way. I think, when he indicated that he was going to reestablish relations with Syria and drop the sanctions, it caught the government here in Washington off guard, and that had been still very, very hesitant to accept, HTS, and very, very suspicious of HTS, which Israel still is. Israel is still very suspicious of Bashar and HTS, and so, and then all of a sudden the government just has to change and get along and go along for the ride with what the president says. No, I think, for the time being, I think there was a great opportunity. I've been talking to some of my Israeli counterparts, and they really think Israel is ruining or missing a tremendous opportunity to develop a relationship with Syria, to have an agreement on the Golan Heights because of their strategic interest right now, or strategic insecurity or feeling of insecurity. And that's what I think I said earlier has just overwhelmed Israel strategically, is the October 7th, 2023 mentality, which is, like Munich, the Munich mentality. It's like, you feel vulnerable in a way you never have before. And there's even still, despite the tremendous suffering in Gaza and the hunger and everything, majority Israeli support for the war there. And because it's still that mentality. So I think until Israel starts to come back from that, it's going to be missing a lot of opportunities and overall opportunities in the region to promote regional peace.
I think you're so right. And I personally think the more they're getting into these conflicts, the insecurity is just going to increase, because despite everything, they haven't been able to eliminate Hamas, they haven't been able to destroy Hezbollah, and they definitely haven't been able to beat Iran. So when all of this does end at some stage, they're going to find that they're going to have a very different kind of a relationship with regional powers.
No, I agree. I mean, they're all about now creating buffers all around Israel and in southern Lebanon and southern Syria, in the Gaza Strip and West Bank even. So, that mentality right now, while seemingly bringing positive strategic returns to Israel in the long term, I think will backfire.
Yes. David, thank you so much for your time and your views. I hugely enjoyed this discussion. And I'm really looking forward to your biography coming out. As I said, let me know when it comes out and I'll share the link with everyone. Do you have a blog or any social media that people can follow you on?
Yeah, we're starting that, and I'll send you those links and information, when that happens. And that's going to be ramping up pretty soon.
That'll be really good. Thank you so much, David, for your time.
Thank you. Always a joy speaking with you. Take care.